On May 28, 1987, the Soviet Union was celebrating Border Guards Day. It was a day of national pride, intended to honor the men who secured the iron perimeter of the Eastern Bloc. But as the parades marched through the streets, high above the clouds, the ultimate embarrassment was already in motion. A small, single-engine Cessna 172B Skyhawk, a civilian aircraft usually reserved for weekend hobbyists, was humming across the horizon. It was not a stealth fighter. It carried no electronic jamming equipment. It moved at a leisurely cruising speed that a modern jet would find agonizing. At the controls sat Matthias Rust, a 19-year-old from West Germany. He was barely an adult, a boy with less than 100 hours of flight experience and a head full of idealistic, world-altering fantasies. He had removed the rear seats of the rented plane to make room for extra fuel tanks, turning the light aircraft into a long-range vessel of defiance. To the military observers of the era, what Rust was attempting was a suicide mission. He was flying directly into the mouth of the most sophisticated air defense network ever constructed by man. Logic dictated that he should have been vaporized by a surface-to-air missile or forced down by interceptors within minutes of crossing the border. And yet the radar screens remained quiet. The missiles stayed on their rails. No one stopped him. To understand the sheer disbelief of the military world that day, one must understand what the Soviet Air Defense, PVO, actually was. At the height of the Cold War, the USSR did not just have a border, they had a wall of steel. The Soviet Union spent billions of rubles ensuring that their airspace was a vacuum. Nothing went in or out without permission. The system was a multi-layered nightmare for any Western strategist. Thousands of radar stations, a constant overlapping signal that could detect a bird at high altitudes, designed specifically to catch high-speed NATO bombers and low-flying cruise missiles. Interceptors on constant alert. Thousands of MiG and Sukhoi fighter jets sat on runways across the Eastern Bloc, their engines ready to roar to life at the first sign of a blip on a screen. The Ring of Fire. Surface-to-air missile batteries, including the formidable S-200 and S-300 systems, were positioned to create a kill zone around every major city, especially Moscow. This was the system that had shot down the U-2 spy plane of Gary Powers in 1960. This was the system that just 4 years prior had tragically destroyed a Korean Airlines Boeing 747, KAL-007, after it strayed into Soviet territory. The PVO was legendary for its hair-trigger responsiveness and its absolute lack of mercy. But as Matthias Rust's Cessna buzzed at low altitude over the Baltic coast, the legendary machine began to grind its gears in a catastrophic display of human error and bureaucratic paralysis. Matthias Rust was not a spy. He was not a trained operative working for the CIA, nor was he a political dissident trying to spark a revolution. He was a West German teenager who had become deeply disillusioned with the state of the world. The mid-1980s were a period of crushing tension. The Able Archer exercises and the rhetoric of the evil empire had convinced many in Europe that nuclear annihilation was inevitable. Rust, possessed by a youthful, dangerous naivete, decided he would build a bridge between the East and the West. He told his parents he was going on a trip to Northern Europe to build up his flight hours. He practiced over the Faroe Islands and Iceland, but in his mind, the destination was always Red Square. He took off from Helsinki, Finland at 12:21 p.m. He turned his radio off. He dipped his wings toward the east. He knew that if he were caught, he would likely be shot down or imprisoned for life. But as the Finnish coast faded behind him, Matthias Rust realized that the greatest danger wasn't the missiles or the MiGs, it was the possibility that his message would be ignored. He didn't know that within hours, his name would be known by every world leader, and the Soviet military leadership would be purged to its very roots. At 14:10 on that fateful May afternoon, the electronic silence of the Soviet border was broken. On a radar screen at a station near the Estonian coast, a tiny luminous blip appeared. It was moving slow, impossibly slow for a NATO intruder, but it was heading south-southeast, directly toward the heart of the motherland. The system did what it was designed to do. It alerted the chain of command. Within minutes, the unknown contact was assigned target number 4731. But as the data moved up the hierarchy of the Soviet Air Defense Forces, PVO, the legendary efficiency of the steel wall began to dissolve into a quagmire of confusion. The commanders in the regional bunker were faced with a riddle. If this was a NATO provocation, where were the jamming signals? Where were the escort fighters? It was a single, low-flying object with the radar cross-section of a bird. In the paranoid logic of the Cold War, the very simplicity of the threat made it invisible. The friendly theory. Some operators assumed it was a small domestic flight that had forgotten to switch on its transponder. The test theory. Others feared it was a secret internal readiness test conducted by Moscow to catch them off guard. The ghost theory. Because the Cessna was flying so low, skimming the treetops to avoid the long-range, high-altitude radar nets, the signal frequently flickered and vanished. The PVO was a rigid, top-down machine. In the Soviet system, initiative was punished, and failure to follow protocol was a death sentence for a career. Commanders hesitated, waiting for confirmation that never came. Orders were issued and then retracted. Responsibility dissolved upward, with each officer hoping the target would either crash or turn around before they had to make a definitive call. No one wanted to be the officer who sparked an international incident, or worse, a nuclear exchange over what might be a lost civilian. While the bureaucrats in the bunkers argued over radar signatures, the Soviet Air Force took to the skies. 2 MiG-23 interceptors were scrambled from a nearby airbase, their engines screaming as they tore through the clouds to intercept target 4731. It didn't take long for the lead pilot to find him. As the supersonic jet throttled down to its absolute minimum speed just to stay level with the intruder, the pilot looked out of his cockpit and couldn't believe his eyes. There, cruising at a mere 100 knots, was a white Cessna 172. It bore civilian tail markings. It had no weapons. And through the side window, the Soviet pilot could clearly see a young man in a light flight suit looking back at him with an expression of calm, almost terrifying resolve. The pilot radioed back to base, describing the scene in disbelief. He requested instructions. Should he force it down? Should he fire a warning burst? Should he engage? The response from the ground was a wall of silence. The rules of engagement had been drastically tightened after the KAL-007 tragedy 4 years earlier, where the shoot-down of a civilian airliner had brought the Soviet Union to the brink of global pariah status. The new protocols required absolute certainty and multiple levels of authorization before a weapon could be fired at a non-military target. For several long, surreal minutes, the most advanced fighter jets in the world flew wingtip to wingtip with a teenager's rented plane. Because Matthias Rust was not behaving like a hostile, he wasn't evasive, he wasn't jamming, and he was flying a low-threat profile, the system paralyzed itself. The interceptors, low on fuel and receiving no clear orders to act, eventually peeled away and returned to base. Matthias Rust was left alone in the sky, a boy in a paper plane who had just survived a brush with the gods of war. By late afternoon, the sprawling outskirts of Moscow began to materialize through the haze. For Matthias Rust, the sight was both a relief and a terrifying realization of what he was about to do. He had been flying for over 5 hours, navigating by simple landmarks and a handheld map, crossing over 1,000 kilometers of the most forbidden territory on Earth. He saw the gold domes of the Kremlin glinting in the evening light. He saw the massive, sprawling expanse of Red Square, the symbolic heart of the Soviet power, where the USSR displayed its missiles and its might every May Day. To any other pilot, this airspace was a death trap, guarded by a ring of surface-to-air missiles and elite anti-aircraft batteries. But the defenses that had terrified the Western world for 40 years remained silent. The ring of steel around Moscow was calibrated to detect high-speed B-52 bombers and cruise missiles. It was not designed to see a light aircraft flying at the speed of an automobile, following the path of the Leningrad Highway like a common commuter. Rust circled the city, looking for a place to land. His original plan was to land inside the Kremlin walls, but he feared the Soviet security services would simply make him disappear and his message of peace would be lost. He needed an audience. He descended, slowly, openly, dropping his flaps and slowing the Cessna until he was hovering just above the streetlights. He touched down on Bolshoi-Moskovetsky Bridge, his wheels screaming on the pavement as he dodged morning traffic and startled pedestrians. He taxied the plane off the bridge and rolled directly into Red Square, coming to a stop just a stone's throw from St. Basil's Cathedral. As the engine sputtered to a halt and the propeller wound down, a crowd of stunned Moscovites began to gather. They didn't see an invader. They saw a boy who had fallen from the stars. The scene in Red Square was a pure absurdity. Matthias Rust climbed out of the Cessna, not with a weapon, but with a pen and paper. He began signing autographs for the bewildered Soviet citizens who assumed him to be a pilot from an Eastern Bloc air show, or perhaps a guest of the government. It took the Soviet police and the KGB over an hour to realize what had actually happened. When the realization finally hit, the panic was seismic. This wasn't just a security breach, it was a total systemic collapse. The news rippled across the globe within hours. Headlines in London, New York, and Paris screamed the impossible truth. Teenager lands in Red Square. For the Soviet leadership, the embarrassment was total. General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev was in East Berlin at the time. When he received the news, he was reportedly incandescent with rage. The incident provided him with the perfect political ammunition to do what he had long desired: purge the old guard of the military. The purge. Within days, the Minister of Defense and the head of the Air Defense Forces were fired. Over 2,000 officers were eventually removed from their posts. The shift. The wall of steel was exposed as a hollow shell built on a foundation of fear and bureaucratic stagnation rather than genuine capability. Matthias Rust was arrested, of course. He was sentenced to 4 years in a labor camp for hooliganism and violating Soviet airspace, though he would eventually be released early as a gesture of goodwill. But the damage to the Soviet image was irreversible. Historians often debate the true impact of Matthias Rust's flight. Some call it a reckless stunt, while others see it as one of the final nails in the coffin of the Cold War. What is undeniable is that the incident changed the internal chemistry of the Soviet Union. The flight proved that the enemy was not the monolith the world believed it to be. It proved that a system built on total control is inherently fragile because it cannot account for the unpredictable, the small, and the idealistic. Matthias Rust didn't use a bomb to crack the Iron Curtain. He used a light aircraft and a complete lack of fear. The incident accelerated Gorbachev's reforms. By clearing out the hardline military leadership, Rust unintentionally paved the way for the signing of the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty later that year. The boy who wanted to build a bridge had succeeded, though not in the way he had imagined. He had exposed the vulnerability of the system, making it impossible for the Soviet Union to continue the charade of absolute military dominance. As the propeller of the Cessna 172 ground to a halt in the center of Red Square, the world shifted on its axis. The sight of a West German teenager in a jumpsuit signing autographs for stunned Muscovites in front of St. Basil's Cathedral was an image that shattered 40 years of Cold War orthodoxy. To the West, it was a moment of high-stakes comedy. To the Soviet Union, it was a catastrophe of existential proportions. The humiliation was total. The wall of steel had been breached by a boy who didn't even have a driver's license. Mikhail Gorbachev, then the General Secretary and a man already looking for ways to modernize the bloated Soviet state, saw the incident as a lightning bolt of opportunity. Within 48 hours, the purge began. It was the largest decapitation of the Soviet military since the days of Stalin, but this time it was done in the name of efficiency. The fall of the giants. Marshal Sergei Sokolov, the Minister of Defense, was fired immediately. Alexander Koldunov, the head of the Air Defense Forces and a legendary World War II ace, was dismissed in disgrace. The structural collapse. The purge didn't stop at the top. Over 2,000 officers, from generals down to regional radar commanders, were stripped of their rank. The acceleration of reform. Rust's flight became the catalyst for perestroika. Gorbachev used the military's embarrassment to neutralize the hardliners who had been blocking his nuclear disarmament treaties. The world was stunned to realize that the machine designed to survive a global nuclear exchange, a system that cost trillions of rubles and employed hundreds of thousands of men, had been dismantled by a single civilian with less than 100 hours in the air. One boy had exposed the terrifying truth. The emperor had no clothes, and the crown was made of plywood. When historians and military analysts look back at May 28, 1987, they don't find a story of technological failure. The Soviet radars had worked perfectly. They had tracked Matthias Rust from the moment he crossed the Estonian coast. The interceptors had worked. They literally flew within feet of his wingtip. The missiles were armed, the communication lines were open, and the electricity was flowing. The failure was not in the wires, it was in the human heart. It was a failure of fear. The Soviet system was a pyramid based on the avoidance of responsibility. In a regime where a single mistake could lead to a labor camp or the end of a family's standing, the officers in the radar bunkers were more afraid of their own superiors than they were of an intruder. Fear of responsibility. No one wanted to be the officer who signed the order to fire. They passed the decision up the chain of command, and as it moved higher, it became more diluted. Fear of escalation. After the international outcry of the Cal 007 shootdown, the command was paralyzed by the thought of accidentally killing another civilian. They overcorrected so far that they became incapable of acting at all. Fear of being wrong. The operators convinced themselves the Cessna was a friendly or a ghost because that was the safest thing to believe. The system was a marvel of automation and technical logic, but it required a human to make the final moral decision to act. When the moment of truth arrived, the humans involved were too terrified of the consequences of being wrong to ever try being right. The wall of steel was perfectly designed to stop a war, but it had no idea how to stop a teenager. Part 9. The day a teenager changed history. Matthias Rust did not return home a hero. He was taken to Lefortovo prison where he was interrogated by the KGB for months. They were convinced he was part of a grand Western conspiracy, refusing to believe that a 19-year-old could be so dangerously, brilliantly simple. He was sentenced to 4 years in a labor camp for hooliganism and illegal entry, eventually serving 14 months before being released as a diplomatic gesture. He returned to West Germany, then faded into a life marked by personal struggles and a desperate search for the same sense of purpose he felt over Moscow. He became a footnote in his own story, a man who lived long enough to see the Iron Curtain fall, but who struggled to live in the world he helped create. But the impact of his flight remained etched into the foundations of the modern world. History is often written as series of grand movements, treaty signed by men in suits or massive divisions of tanks clashing in the desert. But sometimes history turns on a single absurd moment. It turns on a boy in a small plane who didn't know he was supposed to be afraid. The most powerful military machine on Earth was fooled, not by a genius, not by a stealth coding, and not by a grand strategy. It was fooled by its own hesitation. It was defeated by the very system of control it had built to survive. Matthias Rust proved that the only thing more powerful than 1,000,000 missiles is the willingness of one person to ignore the rules and the inability of a system to react when the rules no longer make sense. The Cold War didn't end with a bang. In a very real way, it ended with the quiet sputter of a Cessna engine in Red Square.